In the scorching summer of 1887 Arizona Territory, Margaret Caldwell sat abandoned in her wedding dress, outside a chapel, clutching a telegram that shattered her dreams until a copper-haired boy with dirt-streaked cheeks approached her with the most unexpected invitation of her life. When 7-year-old Billy Hartwell declared, "You're coming with me. My papa is so lonely." Would this broken bride discover that sometimes the family you never planned for becomes exactly what your heart needed most? The church bell rang 12 times, but Margaret Caldwell wished it would never stop. Each clang meant another minute closer to facing the truth, sitting heavy in her stomach like a stone. Her white dress stuck to her back in the Arizona heat, making her feel like a melting candle on this summer day in 1887. "Maybe he's just running late," whispered Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's wife, but her voice sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than Margaret. The older woman kept glancing toward the empty road that led into Prescott, hoping to see dust clouds from a rushing horse. Margaret stared at the piece of paper in her shaking hands. The telegram had arrived just 20 minutes ago, delivered by a sweaty boy who looked sorry to bring such news. The words swam before her eyes, but she had already memorized every cruel letter. "Cannot marry, stop. Business in San Francisco, stop. Regrets, stop. J. Morrison, stop." Her throat felt dry as desert sand. She had sold everything she owned back in Missouri to buy the train ticket west. Her mother's china, her father's pocket watch, even the quilt her grandmother made, all gone to pay for this journey, to marry a man she had only met through letters. James Morrison had written such beautiful words about building a life together in the territory. He promised her a house with a garden and children playing in the yard. Now she sat outside Reverend Hayes' little adobe church, feeling like the biggest fool who ever lived. The other wedding guests had quietly slipped away when the telegram arrived. Even the flowers someone had picked for her bouquet were starting to wilt in the blazing sun. "What will I do now?" Margaret whispered, not really asking anyone in particular. She had exactly $3.47 left in her purse. Not enough for a train ticket home, not enough for more than a few nights at the boarding house, not enough for anything that resembled a future. The desert wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing down Main Street like tiny tornadoes. Margaret watched them spin and wondered if her life was falling apart just as sudden. This morning she woke up thinking she would be Mrs. James Morrison by sunset. Now she was just Margaret Caldwell, alone and broke in a town where she knew nobody. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling wobbly as a newborn colt's. The white dress that had seemed so perfect this morning now felt like a costume for a play that got canceled. People walking by stared at her with curious eyes, some whispering behind their hands. She knew they were talking about the bride who got left at the altar. Stories like this spread faster than wildfire in small towns. Margaret picked up her small traveling bag and started walking, though she had no idea where to go. The boarding house seemed like the only choice, at least for tonight. Maybe tomorrow she could figure out how to wire her cousin in Kansas for money to get home. The thought of admitting her mistake to family made her stomach twist even tighter. The sun beat down on her head like a hammer on an anvil. Sweat dripped down her face, mixing with tears she was trying hard not to shed. She passed the general store, the blacksmith shop, and the saloon where piano music drifted out through swinging doors. Everything looked strange and foreign, like a place from a book about the Wild West rather than somewhere she was supposed to make her home. A dog barked somewhere nearby, and Margaret jumped, her nerves stretched tight as piano wire. She had never been anywhere this far from civilization before. Missouri had proper roads and regular mail delivery, and neighbors you had known your whole life. Here, the mountains looked like sleeping giants, and the sky seemed big enough to swallow a person whole. She was so lost in her worried thoughts that she almost didn't notice the small boy sitting on the steps of the church behind her. When she finally saw him, he was watching her with bright, curious eyes that reminded her of her little brother back home. "You look sadder than our old milk cow when she lost her calf," The boy's voice cut through Margaret's dark thoughts like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, with copper-colored hair that stuck up in all directions and freckles scattered across his nose like cinnamon on toast. Margaret turned around, surprised that anyone was still at the church. "I didn't see you there," she said, trying to smooth down her windblown hair. "Shouldn't you be getting home? It's getting late." The boy shrugged and stayed put on the wooden steps. "Papa's working late at the store again. He always does when he's thinking too hard about things." He tilted his head like a curious puppy. "Are you the lady who was supposed to get married today?" Heat rushed to Margaret's cheeks. "How did you know about that?" "Everyone knows everything in this town," the boy said matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Henderson told Mrs. Murphy at the post office. And Mrs. Quote Murphy told her sister, and her sister told pretty much everybody else." He paused, then added more gently, "I'm sorry your fellow didn't show up. That wasn't very nice of him." Margaret felt fresh tears threatening to spill. "No, it wasn't very nice at all." The boy scooted over on the step, making room. "Want to sit down? You look tired, and that dress looks heavy as a horse blanket." Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling a little. She gathered up her skirts and sat beside him, grateful for the shade of the church's overhanging roof. "What's your name?" "Billy Hartwell," he announced proudly. "My papa runs Hartwell's Mercantile down the street. Best store in town, though that's not saying much, since it's the only store in town." He grinned, showing a gap where he had lost a tooth. "What's your name?" "Margaret Caldwell." She found his cheerful chatter oddly comforting after the awful silence of the afternoon. "How long have you lived here, Billy?" "All my life, which is 7 years, 4 months, and 16 days, Billy said with the precision only children could muster. "Used to live here with Mama too, but she went to heaven 2 winters back when she got the lung fever. Now it's just me and Papa, and sometimes Papa gets awful quiet, especially when he thinks I'm not watching." Margaret's heart squeezed tight. "I'm sorry about your mama." Billy nodded solemnly. "Papa says she's watching over us from up there, but I wish she could watch over us from the kitchen while making biscuits instead." He brightened suddenly. "Papa makes good biscuits now, though. He had to learn after Mama left. Says a man who can't feed his boy properly isn't much of a father." The simple way Billy talked about his loss made Margaret realize her own problems might not be the end of the world. Here was a little boy who had lost his mother, but still found reasons to smile. She felt ashamed of her self-pity. "Your papa sounds like a good man," Margaret said softly. "He is," Billy agreed. "But he gets lonely, something fierce. I can tell even when he pretends he's not. He talks to himself when he's doing inventory, and sometimes I catch him staring out the window like he's waiting for something that ain't never gonna come." Billy suddenly jumped to his feet, his face lighting up like he had just solved a difficult puzzle. "You know what? You should come home with me." Margaret blinked in surprise. "Oh, Billy, I couldn't possibly." "Why not?" Billy interrupted, bouncing on his toes with excitement. "You need somewhere to stay, right? And Papa needs company. Mama always said loneliness was worse for grown-ups than for kids, because grown-ups forget how to make friends easy." The boy's innocent logic was hard to argue with, but Margaret shook her head. "Your papa doesn't even know me. He might not want a stranger in his house." "Papa's not like that," Billy said confidently. "He helped Mrs. Chen when her husband died, and he gave the Rodriguez family credit at the store when their crops failed. Mama taught him that helping folks wasn't about deserving it. It was about being human." Billy grabbed Margaret's hand with both of his small fingers warm and slightly sticky. "Please? Just for supper? Papa makes really good rabbit stew, and I bet he's got extra. He always makes too much food, like he's still cooking for 3 people instead of 2. Margaret looked down at this earnest little boy who seemed determined to solve everyone's problems with simple kindness. She thought about her empty purse, her ruined plans, and the long, uncertain night ahead. Then she thought about Billy's papa, alone in his store, making too much food for a family that had gotten smaller. Just for supper? she asked hesitantly. Billy's grin could have lit up the whole territory. Just for supper, he promised, though something in his bright eyes suggested he might have bigger plans than just one meal. Billy pulled Margaret's hand with the kind of determination that could move mountains. "Papa's gonna be so surprised," he whispered, as they walked past 3 barking dogs and an old woman sweeping her porch. The woman stared at Margaret's fancy white dress, like she'd never seen anything so strange in her whole life. "Billy, I really shouldn't just appear at your father's store," Margaret said, her voice shaking a little. She could smell bread baking somewhere nearby, and it made her stomach growl loudly. She hadn't eaten anything since yesterday morning, back when she still believed James Morrison would marry her today. "Why not?" Billy asked, stopping so suddenly that Margaret almost bumped into him. "Papa always says our door's open to folks who need help, and you look like you need help more than anyone I ever saw." Margaret looked down at her dirty wedding dress and laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "I suppose I do look quite hopeless." They walked past the blacksmith's shop, where a giant man with arms like tree trunks was hammering something that glowed orange hot. Sparks flew everywhere, and the sound was so loud, Margaret had to cover her ears. Billy waved at the blacksmith, who grinned and waved back with his huge hammer. "That's Mr. Peterson," Billy explained. "He made Papa a new horseshoe for our mule last week. Our mule's name is Stubborn Sally, and she lives up to her name something fierce." The Hartwell Mercantile sat at the corner of Main Street and Desert Road. It was a wooden building painted blue, with white trim around the windows. A sign hung over the door that said, "Fair prices, honest deals," in letters that someone had painted very carefully. Through the big front window, Margaret could see shelves full of canned goods, farming tools, and colorful fabric. Billy pushed open the door, making a little bell ring above their heads. The store smelled like coffee beans, leather, and something sweet Margaret couldn't identify. Behind a tall wooden counter stood a man who looked like Billy would look when he grew up. Same copper-colored hair, same green eyes, same stubborn chin. But this man's face told a different story than Billy's. Where Billy's eyes sparkled with mischief and joy, his father's eyes held something sadder. Margaret recognized that look because she'd seen it in her own mirror after her mother died 3 years ago. "Billy," the man said, looking up from a thick book full of numbers, "you're supposed to be helping Mrs. Chen with her chickens." "I finished early, Papa," Billy announced proudly, "and I found something better than chicken eggs." Margaret felt her cheeks turn red as Billy pointed at her, like she was a prize he'd won at the county fair. "This here's Margaret, and she needs a place to stay because someone was mean to her at the church." The man, Billy's papa, set down his pencil and really looked at Margaret for the first time. His eyes traveled from her fancy white dress to her dusty shoes, and Margaret saw his expression change from confusion to understanding to something that might have been anger. "Billy," he said gently, "why don't you go get Miss Margaret a glass of water from the pump out back? She looks thirsty." Billy nodded and ran toward the back of the store, his boots thumping on the wooden floor. As soon as he disappeared through a doorway, the man walked around the counter and extended his hand to Margaret. "I'm David Hartwell," he said. "I'm sorry Billy dragged you here without asking proper permission first. He's got a good heart, but sometimes his enthusiasm gets ahead of his manners." Margaret shook his hand, surprised by how gentle his grip was despite the calluses on his palms. "I'm Margaret Caldwell, and please don't apologize for Billy's kindness. It's been the only bright spot in what's turned out to be the worst day of my life." David studied her face for a moment, and Margaret had the strange feeling he could see right through her polite words to the hurt underneath. "Wedding dress?" he observed quietly. "Beautiful workmanship. Your grandmother's?" "How did you know?" Margaret asked, startled. "Billy's mother had her grandmother's dress," David explained. "Same look in her eyes when she talked about it, like it carried all the hopes of the women who came before her." He paused. "I take it today didn't go as planned?" Margaret's laugh came out like a sob. "That's one way to put it. The groom decided business in San Francisco was more important than marriage in Arizona." David's jaw tightened, and for a moment He looked like he wanted to say something very unpleasant about grooms who abandon brides. Instead, he walked to a chair behind the counter and gestured for Margaret to sit in the customer chair across from him. "Billy mentioned you might need a place to stay," David said carefully. "I don't want to pry into your personal affairs, but if you're truly stranded, I might be able to help." Billy came running back with a tin cup full of water, sloshing half of it on the floor in his excitement. "Did you ask her, Papa? Did you ask if she wants to stay?" "Billy, slow down," David laughed. "Miss Margaret hasn't even had a chance to drink her water yet." Margaret took the cup gratefully and drank deeply. The water was cool and sweet, and she realized how thirsty she'd been sitting in the desert sun. "This is delicious," she said to Billy. "Thank you." Billy beamed like she'd given him a gold medal. "Papa gets the best water from the deepest well in town. He says good water's worth more than gold out here." "Billy's right about that," David agreed. "Water's precious in the desert. Almost as precious as—" He trailed off, looking at his son with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. "As what, Papa?" Billy asked. "As having good people around you," David finished softly. Margaret felt something warm spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the water. When was the last time anyone had called her good people? James Morrison had called her many things. Useful, convenient, adequately pretty, but never good. "Mr. Hartwell," Margaret began, "I appreciate your kindness, but I should be honest. I have almost no money, no place to go, and apparently a reputation as a woman who gets abandoned at the altar. I'm not sure I qualify as good people anymore." David leaned forward in his chair, his green eyes serious. "Miss Caldwell, let me tell you something I learned when my wife Ellen died. People show their true character not when everything's going right, but when everything falls apart. The fact that you're sitting here having a civil conversation, instead of throwing yourself a pity party, tells me plenty about your character." Billy nodded sagely, like he understood exactly what his father meant. "Besides," he added, "Papa always says broken things can be fixed if you got the right tools and enough patience." Margaret looked at this father and son who barely knew her but were treating her like family, and felt tears start to gather in her eyes. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked. David glanced at Billy, who nodded encouragingly. "We've got a small room behind the store that Ellen used for sewing. It's not fancy, but it's clean and private. In exchange, I could use help with the store, keeping books, helping customers, that sort of thing. Billy here could use some company too, and maybe someone to make sure he does his reading lessons." "I already know how to read," Billy protested. "Reading signs and reading books are two different things, son," David said with a grin. Margaret felt like someone had thrown her a rope while she was drowning. "That sounds almost too good to be true," she admitted. "Nothing too good about it." David said practically, "I need the help, Billy needs the company, and you need a place to land while you figure out what comes next. Seems like a fair trade to me." Billy bounced on his toes with excitement. "Does this mean she's staying, Papa? Does this mean I can show her how to feed stubborn Sally?" Margaret looked around the store, at the neat shelves, the carefully swept floors, the ledger book David had been working in. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work and care of his family. For the first time since she'd read James Morrison's telegram, she felt like maybe everything wasn't completely ruined. "If you'll have me," she said to David, "I'd be grateful for the chance." But even as she said the words, Margaret wondered if she was jumping from one kind of trouble into another. What did she really know about these people? And what would the town think about an abandoned bride moving in with a widower and his son? The next morning brought news that made Margaret's stomach drop like a stone thrown down a well. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house came bustling into the mercantile with her arms full of gossip and her eyes bright with the kind of excitement that usually meant trouble for someone else. "David Hartwell, you'll never guess what I heard at breakfast this morning," she announced, setting down a basket of eggs on the counter with unnecessary force. 3 of them cracked, but she didn't seem to notice. Billy looked up from where he was stacking cans of peaches, and Margaret paused in her sweeping. Something about Mrs. Henderson's tone made the hair on Margaret's arms stand up like a cat, sensing danger. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," David said politely, though Margaret could hear wariness in his voice. "What's got you so worked up this early?" "It's about that Morrison fellow, the one who was supposed to marry our new friend here," Mrs. Henderson said, nodding toward Margaret with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "Turns out, he's got bigger problems than cold feet." Margaret's hands tightened on the broom handle. "What kind of problems?" Mrs. Henderson practically vibrated with the importance of her news. "Well, my cousin Ruth runs the boarding house over in Phoenix, and she sent word that two very rough-looking men came through town yesterday asking questions about James Morrison. Seems he owes them a considerable sum of money." The can Billy was holding slipped from his fingers and rolled across the floor with a metallic clatter that seemed loud as thunder in the suddenly quiet store. David stepped closer to Margaret, and she noticed he positioned himself between her and the door. "What kind of men?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The kind that carry guns and don't smile much," Mrs. Henderson replied, clearly enjoying the drama. "Ruth said they were asking about Morrison's business dealings, his debts, and—" She paused for dramatic effect. "His intended bride." Margaret felt all the blood drain from her face. "They were asking about me?" "Indeed they were, dear. Seems Morrison promised them your dowry money to cover what he owes. When he disappeared without a trace, they decided to track down anyone connected to him." Billy walked over and stood next to Margaret, his small hand slipping into hers. For a 7-year-old, he seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation better than many adults would. "How much money are we talking about?" David asked. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward conspiratorially. Ruth heard it was over $1,000. Margaret laughed, but it came out sharp and bitter. $1,000? My entire dowry was $200, and my grandmother's china set. James Morrison lied to them, just like he lied to me. Desperate men don't always stop to check facts, David observed grimly. "Did your cousin say which direction these men were headed?" "North toward Prescott," last she heard. "Ruth figured they'd be here by tomorrow, maybe the day after, if they stopped to ask questions in other towns along the way." After Mrs. Henderson left, with her cracked eggs and satisfied expression, the store felt too quiet. Billy sat on the floor organizing nails by size, but Margaret could tell he was listening to every word the adults said. David stood at the window, looking out at the dusty street like he expected trouble to come walking down at any minute. "I should leave," Margaret said finally. "I won't bring danger to you and Billy." David turned from the window, his expression firm. "Where would you go? You said yourself you don't have money for a stage ticket." "I'll figure something out. Maybe I could work for passage. Or, no." Billy's voice was small but determined. He looked up from his nails with tears in his eyes. "You just got here. You can't leave already." Margaret knelt down beside him, her heart aching at the distress on his young face. "Billy, sometimes grown-ups have problems that are too big to solve just by wanting them to go away. But Papa's real good at solving problems," Billy said, looking between Margaret and his father. "He fixed Mrs. Chen's wagon when it broke. He helped Mr. Peterson when his horse got sick. He can fix this too." David sat down in his chair behind the counter, running his hands through his copper hair. "This isn't like fixing a wagon wheel, son. These men sound dangerous." "How dangerous?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Men who loan money to gamblers and don't get paid back?" David shook his head. "They don't usually ask politely for what they're owed, and they won't care that you're innocent in all this." Margaret sank into the customer chair, feeling trapped between bad choices. Stay and put David and Billy in danger, or leave and face dangerous men alone in the desert with no money and nowhere to go. "What if we talk to Sheriff Martinez?" Billy suggested. "He's got a big gun and everything." David considered this. Sheriff's a good man, but he can't arrest people for asking questions. And even if these men break the law, by the time we could prove it, someone might get hurt. The afternoon wore on with customers coming and going, but Margaret could barely concentrate on helping them. Every time the doorbell rang, she jumped. Every unfamiliar voice made her heart race. David noticed her nervousness and started handling most of the customers himself, leaving Margaret to work on inventory in the back room where she felt safer. Billy brought her a sandwich around noon, thick slices of bread with butter and jam that probably cost more than she should eat, given her circumstances. But when she tried to say so, he just shook his head stubbornly. "Mama always said food tastes better when you share it with people you care about," he announced. Then took a big bite of his own sandwich. Like that settled the matter. As the sun started to set, painting the desert sky brilliant orange and purple, David closed the store early. He sent Billy to feed stubborn Sally and check that all the doors were locked tight. "I've been thinking," David said to Margaret as they stood alone in the store. "These men are looking for James Morrison's bride, right? That's what Mrs. Henderson said. Well, what if James Morrison's bride wasn't here anymore? What if Margaret Caldwell had moved on, and nobody knew where she went?" Margaret stared at him. "You want me to pretend to be someone else?" "Not pretend exactly. Just let people think you left town. Mrs. Henderson loves to spread news almost as much as she loves to collect it. If she happened to hear that you caught the morning stage to California, word would get around fast." "But where would I actually be?" David's cheeks turned slightly red, but his voice stayed steady. "Right here. Hidden in plain sight. Lots of folks come and go in a place like this. Easy to blend in if you dress different and keep a low profile." Billy came running back from the barn, his boots clattering on the wooden floor. "Stubborn Sally says hello," he announced. "Well, she didn't actually say it, but she didn't try to kick me, which is pretty much the same thing from her." Margaret looked at these two people who were willing to risk their safety for a woman they'd known less than 2 days. The smart thing would be to refuse their help and leave town immediately. The smart thing would be to face her problems alone, rather than drag innocent people into danger. But sitting in the gathering darkness of the mercantile, surrounded by the smell of coffee beans and the warmth of unexpected kindness, Margaret realized she was tired of always doing the smart thing. Sometimes, the smart thing was also the loneliest thing. "What exactly did you have in mind?" she asked David. His smile was small but determined. "Well, first we need to get you some different clothes. That wedding dress is beautiful, but it makes you pretty memorable." Billy clapped his hands together. "Ooh, like a disguise. Like in the adventure books." "Not quite like the books, son," David said gently. "This is real, and if we're not careful, real people could get hurt." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cooling desert air. Tomorrow, dangerous men would come to Prescott, looking for her. Tomorrow, she would find out if kindness was stronger than fear, and if a abandoned bride could disappear completely without actually going anywhere at all. But tonight, she was still Margaret Caldwell, and she was not alone. The store's bell rang, like a warning shot, just as Billy was learning to sound out the word dragon from his fairy tale book. Margaret felt her stomach drop when she saw the two men walk through the door. Their fancy city clothes couldn't hide the meanness in their eyes, or the way they moved like wolves hunting for dinner. "Well, well," said the bigger man, his voice smooth as honey but twice as sticky. "Looks like we found ourselves a cozy little family scene." He had hands like ham hocks and a smile that made Margaret's skin crawl. His partner was skinnier but meaner looking, with eyes that darted around the store like he was counting everything worth stealing. Billy pressed himself against Margaret's side, his small fingers gripping her skirt. Even at 7 years old, he could smell danger better than a rabbit sensing a fox. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered Mrs. Henderson's warning about rough men asking questions. David looked up from organizing grain sacks behind the counter. His movement stayed calm and steady, but Margaret noticed how his hands positioned themselves near the shotgun he kept for emergencies. "Gentlemen," he said politely, though his tone suggested they were anything but. "Something I can help you find?" The big man laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a cliff. "Oh, we already found what we're looking for." His eyes fixed on Margaret like a snake watching a mouse. You must be the famous Margaret Caldwell. Heard you were supposed to marry our good friend James Morrison." Margaret's mouth went dry as desert sand. She'd hoped Morrison's creditors would give up and move on to easier targets. But here they stood in her safe place, bringing all her fears to life, like monsters stepping out of a night. "Can't say I know anyone by that name," David said, stepping forward. The lie rolled off his tongue smooth as butter. But Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. He was calculating distances, figuring out how fast he could reach his gun if things went bad. Billy surprised everyone by standing up straighter, his young voice cutting through the thick air. "My papa don't lie," he announced, with the fierce loyalty only children possessed. "If he says he don't know her, then he don't." The skinny man snorted with amusement. "Kid's got spirit, I'll give him that." He pulled out a wrinkled photograph, Margaret's engagement picture, that Morrison must have carried. "But this here says different. Same pretty face, same dark hair. You're her, all right." Margaret felt trapped, like a bird in a cage. Her old life had followed her here, threatening to destroy the new happiness she'd found. But something had changed inside her during these past few weeks in Prescott. She wasn't the same scared woman who'd sat crying on the chapel steps. "So what if I am?" she said, standing up and facing the men directly. Her voice shook only a little. "James Morrison abandoned me. I don't owe him anything, and I certainly don't owe you anything." The big man's smile turned ugly. "See, that's where you're wrong, sweetheart. Morrison promised us your dowry money to cover his gambling debts. Man's word is his bond, even if the man himself turns yellow and runs. Especially when the man owes us $5,000, the skinny one added, picking his teeth with a dirty fingernail. "Money's money, whether it comes from the groom or the bride." David moved closer to Margaret, his presence solid and reassuring. "The lady doesn't owe Morrison's debts," he said firmly, "and she's under my protection now." Billy grabbed Margaret's hand, his small fingers surprisingly strong. "She's got family here," he declared boldly. "Real family that takes care of each other." The words hit Margaret like lightning. Family. Not because of marriage contracts or business arrangements, but because they'd chosen each other. The realization gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. "You heard them," Margaret said, lifting her chin defiantly. "I'm not some piece of property you can collect like a gambling chip. Find Morrison if you want your money, but leave me out of it." The big man's face turned red as a sunset. "Lady, you don't seem to understand how this works. Morrison's gone like smoke in the wind. That makes you responsible for his promises." "That's not how the law works," David said quietly, but his hand had found its way to the shotgun's stock. "And this is my store. I'm asking you nicely to leave." The skinny man laughed nastily. "Your store? Your rules, huh? What about when we come back tonight? Still gonna be your rules when your pretty little family's sleeping?" Margaret felt ice in her veins despite the desert heat. These men weren't just after money, they enjoyed causing fear. They fed on other people's terror, like buzzards picking at bones. But Billy stepped forward again, his face set with determination that reminded Margaret of his father. "You heard us, and Sheriff Martinez will hunt you down like the coyotes you are. He don't like bullies picking on families." The mention of the sheriff made both men pause. Even criminals had to worry about lawmen in territories where justice moved fast and final. Besides, Billy continued with startling wisdom, if you hurt good people, word spreads. No town between here and California will sell you supplies or let you stay in their hotels. You'll be marked men with nowhere to run. Margaret stared at the boy in amazement. Where had such understanding come from? But she saw David's proud smile and realized Billy had learned these lessons at his father's knee, absorbing wisdom about community and consequence, like a sponge soaking up water. The big man's confident expression wavered. He'd expected easy intimidation, not a united front of people willing to fight back. Bullies always preferred victims who cowered alone, not families who stood together. "This ain't over," he growled. But his threat sounded hollow now. "Morrison owes us, and we always collect our debts, one way or another. Then you'd better start looking for Morrison instead of bothering innocent people, David replied calmly. His hand never left the shotgun, and his eyes never left the intruders. The two men exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Margaret held her breath, waiting to see if they'd push the confrontation into violence. But something in David's steady gaze and Billy's fierce protectiveness must have warned them off. They turned toward the door, but the skinny one couldn't resist one final threat. "Enjoy your little family while you can, lady. Nothing stays safe forever in this territory." The bell chimed again as they left, but the sound offered no relief. Margaret sank into a chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The danger had passed for now, but she knew it would return, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Billy climbed into her lap without invitation, his small arms wrapping around her neck. "Don't worry," he whispered fiercely. "Papa and me won't let anyone hurt you. You're ours now." Margaret couldn't sleep that night, listening to every creak and whistle of wind that might signal the return of Morrison's creditors. She lay on her narrow cot in the store's back room, staring at ceiling beams painted silver by moonlight, and wondered if staying in Prescott had put David and Billy in terrible danger. The wedding dress hung in the corner like a ghost of her former self. The woman who'd believed her value came from someone else's promises. Now she understood how foolish that thinking had been. But understanding didn't erase the threats those men had made. Morning came with the sound of Billy chattering excitedly in the front room. Margaret found him arranging penny candy, while David counted coins from the cash drawer, both acting as if dangerous men hadn't invaded their peaceful world just hours before. "Did you sleep at all?" David asked quietly, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. "Not much," Margaret admitted. She watched Billy organize peppermint sticks by size, his young face serious with concentration. "I keep thinking about what that man said. About nothing. Staying safe forever." David set down his coins and looked at her directly. His eyes were warm but honest. He wouldn't lie to make her feel better. "Bad men exist everywhere, Margaret. In big cities and small towns, in fancy houses and frontier settlements. You can't run from every shadow." Billy looked up from his candy arrangement. "Besides, running away means giving up the good stuff too. Like biscuits for breakfast and stories before bed, and having people who love you even when you're scared." The simple wisdom in his words made Margaret's throat tight with emotion. When had this 7-year-old boy become so wise about matters that confused grown adults? "But I brought this trouble to your door," Margaret said, guilt weighing heavy on her shoulders. "If I hadn't come here, those men would never have. If you hadn't come here," David interrupted gently, "Billy would still be lonely. I'd still be cooking terrible meals, and this place would feel empty as a church on Monday." He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Trouble finds everyone eventually. At least this way, we face it together." The store's bell chimed, making all three of them freeze with tension. But instead of dangerous creditors, Mrs. Henderson bustled through the door carrying a basket covered with checkered cloth. "Brought you folks some fresh bread," she announced, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Also wanted you to know, Sheriff Martinez ran those 2 troublemakers out of town this morning. Told them Prescott didn't welcome their kind of business." Margaret felt relief flow through her like cool water. "They're really gone? Saw them ride out myself, heading east toward the railroad. Sheriff made it clear they weren't welcome back." Mrs. Henderson set her basket on the counter and fixed Margaret with a knowing look. "Word's gotten around about what they wanted. Folks in this town don't take kindly to strangers threatening our people." Our people. Margaret felt the words settle into her heart like seeds finding fertile ground. Somewhere between that first day on the chapel steps and this moment, she'd stopped being an outsider and become part of something bigger than herself. Billy bounced excitedly. "Does that mean they won't come back? Ever?" "Men like that are cowards at heart, Mrs. Praft," Henderson said firmly. "They prey on folks who are alone and scared. But when a whole community stands together, Bullies usually find easier targets elsewhere. After Mrs. Henderson left, Margaret helped David stock shelves while Billy played with wooden blocks in the corner. The ordinary activities felt precious after yesterday's fear-proof that life could continue, that happiness didn't have to be sacrificed to other people's greed. "I have something to tell you," Margaret said as she arranged jars of preserves. Her heart hammered nervously, but some conversations couldn't be delayed forever. About my past, about who I was before I came here. David's hands stilled on a bag of flour. "You don't owe me explanations, Margaret." "Yes, I do." She took a deep breath, gathering courage like collecting wildflowers. "I wasn't just some innocent woman abandoned by a cruel man. I was foolish and desperate. I answered Morrison's advertisement for a mail-order bride because I had nowhere else to go." She waited for judgment, for disappointment, for the withdrawal of respect she'd grown to treasure. But David just nodded thoughtfully. "My wife answered my advertisement too," he said quietly, surprising her completely. "Most marriages out here start with practical arrangements. Love grows from choosing each other day after day, not from romantic first meetings." Billy looked up from his blocks. "Mama used to say love wasn't about fancy beginnings, but about staying through the hard parts." Margaret stared at both of them, amazed by their acceptance. In her previous life, being a mail-order bride had felt shameful, desperate. Here, it was simply one path among many that led to family. "I had nothing to offer Morrison except hope," Margaret continued, needing to finish her confession. "No money, no important family connections, no special skills. When he abandoned me, I thought it proved I wasn't worth loving." David set down the flour bag and faced her completely. "Margaret, you've been helping with the books better than anyone I've hired. You've taught Billy to read better than his schoolteacher ever did. You've made this place feel like a home instead of just a store." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your worth isn't something Morrison could take with him when he left." Billy abandoned his blocks and ran to hug Margaret's legs. "You're worth everything to us," he declared with a fierce certainty only children possessed. "Papa smiles more now, and I don't have nightmares about being alone anymore." Margaret knelt down to Billy's level, her eyes wet with tears she didn't try to hide. "You saved me, you know, both of you. When you found me on that bench, I thought my story was ending, but you showed me it was just beginning." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting everything golden and warm. Margaret looked around the store that had become her sanctuary, at the man who'd offered shelter without expecting anything in return, at the boy who'd claimed her with the pure honesty of unconditional love. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be valued for who she was, rather than what she could provide. Morrison's abandonment, which had felt like the cruelest rejection, had actually been a gift freedom to discover her real worth, with people who could recognize it. "So what happens now?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer. David smiled, the expression reaching his eyes and transforming his entire face. "Now we keep building something worth protecting. Together." Billy cheered and spun in a happy circle, his laughter filling the store like music. Margaret watched him dance and realized that sometimes the most profound victories weren't won through fighting, but through refusing to let other people's limitations define your possibilities. The wedding dress could stay in its trunk. This new life she was building didn't need the costume of someone else's dreams. It needed only the courage to keep choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, and hope over the bitter lessons of disappointment. Outside, the Arizona territory stretched endless and full of promise, and Margaret Caldwell, no longer abandoned, no longer alone, was ready to embrace whatever adventures lay ahead. The church bell rang 7 times that morning, but it wasn't Sunday. Margaret rushed outside the mercantile to see black smoke rising from the direction of the schoolhouse. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she grabbed her shawl and ran toward the commotion. Half the town had gathered around the one-room building where children learned their letters. Flames licked at the wooden walls, while Reverend Hayes and Doc Peterson organized bucket lines from the well. Margaret searched the crowd frantically, until she spotted Billy's copper hair near the front steps. "Thank goodness you're safe," she breathed, pulling him close. His clothes smelled like smoke and his face was streaked with soot. "Miss Margaret, the books are still inside." Billy's voice cracked with worry. "All those stories we read together, they're burning up." David appeared beside them, his shirt damp with sweat from fighting the fire. "Building's too far gone," he said grimly. "But everyone got out alive." "The flames had started before dawn," Sheriff Coleman explained to the growing crowd. Someone had seen a stranger riding away from town just as the fire began. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. "Reckon it might be connected to those men who came looking for Morrison's bride," the sheriff added quietly to David. "Seems they didn't take kindly to leaving empty-handed." Margaret's stomach dropped. The fire wasn't an accident, it was revenge. Because she had refused to pay another person's debts, innocent children would have no place to learn. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house wiped tears from her eyes. "Where will the children go to school now? Winter's coming, and we can't rebuild before spring." The crowd murmured with worry. Prescott was growing, and families had moved here partly because of the school. Without it, some might pack up and leave for bigger towns with better opportunities. Billy tugged on Margaret's skirt. "Can't we teach them at the store? You know, all the same things Miss Patterson taught." "Oh, sweet boy, I don't know if I'm qualified." "You taught me to read better than anyone," Billy interrupted with fierce loyalty. "And you know numbers from helping Papa with the books." An idea began forming in Margaret's mind, fragile as a soap bubble, but growing stronger with each breath. She looked around at the worried faces, parents wondering about their children's futures. Youngsters like Billy who loved learning. Older folks who remembered what it felt like to grow up without education. "Billy might be onto something," she said slowly. "The mercantile has that big room in the back where we store grain in winter. If we moved some things around." David's eyes lit up with understanding. "We could clear space for desks and chairs. The light's good back there. And there's room for 20 children easy." "But supplies?" asked Martha Stevens, whose 3 boys needed schooling. "Books, slates, chalk, everything burned." Margaret thought about the small savings she'd been putting aside from her work at the store, money she'd planned to spend on a proper dress for when David proposed, though he hadn't asked yet and might never. Her heart squeezed at giving up that dream, but some things mattered more than wedding finery. "I can cover basic supplies to start," she said. "Paper, pencils, a few reading primers from the catalog." The crowd began buzzing with excitement. Parents offered to help clear the storage room and build simple desks. Mrs. Patterson, the former teacher, had moved to Phoenix but left behind lesson plans with Reverend Hayes. Doc Peterson promised to donate his old medical books for older students interested in science. But Margaret felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was promising. Teaching one eager boy was different from managing 20 children of different ages and abilities. What if she failed them? What if parents lost confidence and pulled their children out? What if she wasn't smart enough or patient enough or— "You're scared," David observed quietly, as the crowd dispersed to begin preparations. "Terrified," she admitted. "I only finished 8th grade myself. What business do I have teaching others?" Billy had wandered off to examine the still smoking ruins with other children, giving the adults a moment of privacy. "My Sarah only finished 6th grade, David said gently, speaking of his late wife for the first time since Margaret had known him. "But she was the wisest person I ever met." Education isn't just about book learning. It's about caring enough to help someone grow. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She'd been so focused on her own limitations that she'd forgotten what Billy had taught her months ago. Sometimes the most important qualification was simply being willing to try. Besides, David continued with a half smile, "I seem to remember a certain young woman who thought she wasn't qualified to help run a store either. Look how that turned out." Over the next 2 weeks, the entire town rallied around the project. Men hauled grain sacks to the main store area and built simple benches with planks and sawhorses. Women sewed curtains for the windows and brought quilts to soften the hard floors. Children swept and scrubbed until the room gleamed. Margaret spent evenings poring over lesson plans by lamplight, reviewing arithmetic she hadn't used in years, and practicing reading aloud to make sure her voice would carry to the back of the room. Her hands shook the first few nights as doubt crept in. But gradually, confidence grew alongside preparation. The day before school was set to begin, a package arrived on the afternoon stage. Margaret's heart skipped when she saw her name written in careful script on the brown paper wrapping. Inside, she found a dozen brand new readers, writing tablets, colored chalk, and a hand-drawn map of the United States. The letter tucked inside was signed by Miss Patterson herself. Dear Miss Caldwell, I heard about the fire and your generous offer to teach our children. Please accept these supplies as a gift from one educator to another. The children of Prescott are lucky to have someone who cares more about their futures than her own comfort. Education is not about knowing everything. It's about inspiring curiosity and kindness. You already possess both in abundance. Margaret sat down hard on a grain sack, overwhelmed by gratitude and the weight of trust being placed in her hands. Through the window, she could see Billy and his friends playing in the dusty street, their laughter carrying on the desert wind. Tomorrow, those same children would sit in neat rows, looking to her for guidance and knowledge. The responsibility felt enormous, but for the first time, it also felt possible. David found her there as the sun set, surrounded by books and supplies and dreams taking shape. Ready for your first day? He asked. Margaret looked around the transformed room, humble but clean, simple but filled with hope. I think I am, she said, and meant it. That night, she fell asleep not to worry but to excitement, wondering what she might learn from her students and what adventures awaited in the pages of books they'd explored together. The fire that was meant to destroy had instead created something new and beautiful, and Margaret finally understood that sometimes the best gifts came wrapped in the most challenging circumstances. A sharp crack split the morning air, followed by a child's scream that made Margaret's blood turn cold. She dropped her lesson plans and rushed outside to find Billy crumpled in the dirt, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. He was climbing the oak tree behind Peterson's place, gasped Jenny Martinez, tears streaming down her 8-year-old face. The branch broke and he fell so far. Margaret knelt beside Billy, whose face had gone white with pain. His left leg was clearly broken, and she could see the fear in his eyes as he tried not to cry in front of his classmates. Don't move, sweetheart, she said gently, pushing her own panic aside. David, Doc Peterson. Within minutes, both men arrived running. Doc Peterson took one look at Billy's leg and shook his head grimly. Bones broken clean through, he said quietly to David. I can set it, but he'll need proper rest for weeks. No running, no climbing, probably no walking without crutches until Christmas. Billy's face crumpled at this news. Margaret knew how much he loved exploring the desert, racing other children, and helping his father around the store. Being stuck indoors would feel like prison to an active boy. But there was another problem that made Margaret's stomach clench with worry. With Billy unable to move around easily, how could David manage the store alone? Harvest season was approaching, which meant farmers would need supplies and wanted to sell their crops. It was the busiest time of year for the mercantile. And what about school? Today was supposed to be her first official day teaching, with 20 eager children waiting for lessons. She couldn't be in two places at once, caring for Billy and educating the other students. As Doc Peterson carefully moved Billy inside to set his leg, Margaret felt the familiar weight of impossible choices. Just when she'd found her purpose and place in this community, circumstances threatened to tear it all apart. Miss Margaret, whispered Lucy Henderson, tugging on her skirt. Is Billy going to be okay? Will we still have school? Margaret looked down at the worried little face and felt her heart squeeze. These children had already lost their schoolhouse to fire. Now they might lose their teacher too, through no fault of their own. Let me think, Lucy, she said gently. We'll figure something out. But privately, Margaret wondered if she was fooling herself. Maybe she'd taken on too much too quickly. Maybe this was life's way of telling her to stick to simpler dreams. David emerged from the store looking exhausted. Billy was resting on a cot in the back room, his leg splinted and bandaged, but the pain medicine made him sleepy and confused. "He keeps asking for his mama," David said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "When he's hurting bad, he forgets she's gone." Margaret felt tears threaten. This wonderful man and precious boy had given her a new life when she had nothing. Now they needed her help more than ever, but she didn't know how to be everywhere at once. "The children are waiting," David continued. "Their parents dropped them off, expecting school to start today. What do we tell them?" Before Margaret could answer, she heard voices approaching from the street. A group of women walked toward the store, led by Mrs. Stevens and Mrs. Martinez. "We heard about Billy's accident," Mrs. Stevens announced, "and we know you're worried about managing school and caring for him at the same time." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "So, we've made a decision," Mrs. Martinez continued. "Those of us with older children are going to take turns helping with Billy during school hours. And Mrs. Patterson sent word from Phoenix that she's coming back temporarily to assist with teaching until you get settled into a routine." Margaret stared at them in amazement. "But why would you do all that?" "Because this town needs its school," Mrs. Stevens said simply. "And our children need a teacher who cares about them the way you do. We're not going to let one accident destroy what we've all worked to build." Over the following weeks, the community proved that cooperation could overcome almost any obstacle. While Margaret taught lessons in the morning, women took shifts sitting with Billy, reading to him and helping him with his own schoolwork. In the afternoons, Margaret worked at the store while the older boys helped David with heavy lifting and deliveries. But the real surprise came from Billy himself. Unable to run and play, he discovered a love for drawing and writing that no one had expected. He began creating illustrated stories about desert adventures, complete with talking coyotes and magical tumbleweeds. "Look, Miss Margaret," he said one afternoon, showing her a detailed picture of the schoolhouse before the fire. "I drew it, so we won't forget what it looked like." Margaret studied the careful lines and shading, amazed by the talent he'd never had time to explore when he was constantly in motion. "Billy, this is beautiful. Have you ever thought about becoming an artist?" His eyes lit up. "Could I really? Even with a bad leg?" "Especially with that creative mind of yours," she assured him. "Some of the greatest artists in the world found their talent when they had to slow down and really look at the world around them." As autumn deepened into winter, Billy's leg healed stronger than expected. But his passion for art remained. He began illustrating reading lessons for the younger children and creating maps of the territory for geography studies. Margaret watched him adapt and grow, remembering her own journey from abandoned bride to confident teacher. Life rarely unfolded according to plan, but sometimes the detours led to discoveries that planned routes would have missed entirely. The school in the mercantile back room thrived beyond everyone's expectations. Children learned not just reading and arithmetic, but practical skills like keeping store accounts and measuring grain. Parents appreciated the real-world education their children received alongside traditional lessons. One snowy December evening, as Margaret graded papers by lamplight while Billy drew nearby and David balanced the day's receipts, she reflected on the strange path that had brought them together. A broken engagement had led to found family. A devastating fire had created new opportunities. A serious accident had revealed hidden talents. "What are you smiling about?" David asked, noticing her expression. "Just thinking about how none of this was supposed to happen," she said. 6 months ago, I thought my life was ruined. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Billy looked up from his drawing. "Papa says the best adventures are the ones you never planned for." "Smart Papa," Margaret agreed, catching David's eye across the warm room. Outside, the desert wind howled with winter's bite. But inside, the mercantile turned schoolhouse turned home. 3 people who had found each other against all odds settled in for another evening of simple contentment. The future stretched ahead full of unknowns, but Margaret had learned that uncertainty wasn't something to fear. It was the canvas on which life's most beautiful surprises were painted, and she was finally ready for whatever picture emerged next.